The last time Commander Vexel felt fear, he had been a cadet 11 years old, watching his homeworld skies split open with the fire of a dying star. That was 300 years ago. Since then, he had erased that feeling from himself the way his people had erased 47 worlds from the list of the free. Now he stood on the bridge of the Ash Ground, flagship of the Katari Dominion's 9th Conquest Fleet, and felt nothing at all. Below him on the tactical display, a small blue world spun quietly in the dark, utterly unaware that its final peaceful hour was ticking away. Earth, population approximately 9 billion, said his tactical officer, a narrow-eyed Kathari named Zarek. No orbital defense platforms detected. No warp signatures. No energy readings above what you'd expect from a pre-conquest agricultural world with some industrial development. Vexel almost laughed. In 3 centuries of conquest, the Dominion had never once been surprised. They did not need to be. They had a formula, refined across 47 campaigns. Scout for a century, catalog every weapon, every fortress, every general who might resist, and then arrive with enough overwhelming force that resistance became a formality rather than a war. They don't even know we exist, Sarah continued, unable to hide the boredom in his voice. Their most advanced deep space telescopes couldn't detect our cloaking field from this range. This will be over before their morning news cycle even begins. Good, Vexel said. I'm tired of wars that take longer than a decade. He was not being cruel. In his mind, he was being merciful. The Dominion's philosophy, drilled into every cadet since the Kathari had first left their scorched homeworld, was simple. Overwhelming force, applied swiftly, minimized suffering. A quick surrender saved more lives than a drawn-out war pride. Vexel had told himself this so many times that he had stopped noticing it was also the easiest way to sleep at night after annihilating a species' capacity to say no. 47 star systems did not resist a 48th invasion by choice. They resisted because resistance was, in the Dominion's cold arithmetic, statistically improbable to succeed and virtually guaranteed to increase casualties. So the Dominion had learned and taught and enforced, kneel quickly and live. Earth would kneel. Earth would beg to kneel, once it understood what waited above its clouds. Fleet position confirmed, Sarek reported. 1,200 vessels in formation. Singularity cannons charged. Ground suppression teams standing by. Shall I open a communication channel to their governments? Commander? Standard surrender protocol. Vexel considered it. Tradition dictated a warning, a chance for the enemy to understand futility of resistance before the first shot was fired. It made the eventual occupation smoother. Populations that surrender without a fight rebuilt faster, resented less, integrated sooner into Dominion's endless machine of expansion. Open the channel, Vexel said. Let them see what's coming. Let them choose peace. The message went out in every language humanity's own broadcasts had taught the Dominion's linguists over the preceding century of quiet observation. A single sentence, translated 1,000 ways, arriving simultaneously in every corner of a world that had no idea it was being watched. Your world is now within range of the Kathari Dominion. Surrender is not weakness. Resistance is not possible. You have 1 hour. Vexel expected panic. He expected confusion, denial, perhaps a scramble of military assets that would accomplish nothing but delay the inevitable by a few pointless minutes. What he did not expect was silence, not the silence of ignorance. His sensors confirmed the message had been received, decoded, distributed. Every major broadcast network on the planet had gone quiet within 4 minutes. Every military communication channel had gone dark within 6. It was not the silence of a species too primitive to respond. It was the silence of a species that had already known this day was coming, and had already decided exactly what to do. Commander, Sarek said slowly, and for the first time in years, Vexel heard something unfamiliar in his tactical officer's voice. Something close to unease. I'm reading movement. Multiple contacts. They weren't there 30 seconds ago. Vexel turned to the display. Where empty space had shown nothing but Earth and its lonely moon, dozens of new signatures were now blooming into existence. Not approaching from beyond sensor range, not decloaking from some hidden position nearby, but simply appearing, as though space itself had been folded back to reveal what had always been waiting underneath. That's not possible, Sarek whispered. "Nothing can bypass our detection grid like that. Nothing in the galaxy." "Recalculate." Vexel snapped, though something cold was beginning to move through his chest. An old and unwelcome visitor. "Confirm contact identification." The answer came back in less than a second, and it told Commander Vexel everything he needed to know about how badly he had misjudged this primitive agricultural world. 40 human vessels. Each one, according to every sensor reading the Ashground possessed, was radiating an energy signature that made his own flagship look like a candle beside a star. "Sir," Sarek said, "I don't think this is going to be over before their morning news cycle." Vexel said nothing. He was watching one of the human vessels, small compared to the Ashground, but somehow drinking in his senses' attention like gravity itself, as a section of its hull began to glow with a light that had no name in any language the Dominion had ever catalogued. For the first time in 300 years, Commander Vexel felt fear again, and somewhere in the dark behind Earth's moon, in a place his sensors had never once detected in a century of watching, an intelligence far older than his entire civilization finally opened its eyes and looked back. 300 light years away, in the archive vaults of the Kathari homeworld, there was a saying carved into the stone of the Academy where every officer trained: "An enemy who does not fight has already lost." Commander Vexel had believed that sentence his entire life. In the next 4 minutes, he would learn exactly how wrong it was. "Status," he barked, gripping the edge of the tactical console as the Ashground shuddered under a wave of sensor interference that shouldn't have been possible against Dominion-grade shielding. 40 vessels confirmed, Commander, but the number is... Sarek's voice cracked, an unthinkable breach of protocol. "The number is climbing. 60, 90. They're not arriving. They were already here, cloaked, this entire time." Vexel's mind raced through the mathematics of catastrophe. A century of surveillance. A century of quiet passes by Dominion scout ships, each one reporting the same reassuring conclusion: a young, undefended, gloriously conquerable world. Not one of those scouts had detected so much as a whisper of what was now unfolding across his tactical display. That meant one of two things. Either Dominion technology was catastrophically inferior to something hiding in the system, or humanity had let every scout see exactly what it wanted them to see. "Order the fleet to..." Vexel began, but he never finished the sentence. The first human vessel fired. There was no visible weapon discharge. No beam, no projectile, no flash of energy crossing the gulf of space the way every weapon in Vexel's 3 centuries of warfare had always looked. There was simply a battle group of 12 Kathari cruisers, arranged in standard defensive formation on his display. And then there was empty space where they had been, with no debris, no wreckage, no expanding cloud of superheated gas. They had not been destroyed. They had been erased, as cleanly as a hand wiping condensation from glass. The bridge went silent except for the frantic clicking of sensor stations trying to make sense of readings that violated everything the Dominion's finest scientists understood about the universe. "Report," Vexel said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. 300 years of command discipline, the only thing holding the word together. 12 ships gone, said a junior officer near the rear of the bridge, her voice thin with disbelief. "Not destroyed, sir. There's no matter signature at all. It's as if they were subtracted from reality." Vexel had led invasions against species who fought with nuclear weapons, plasma cannons, even crude gravity-well mines scavenged from asteroid belts. He had seen ships torn apart, crews vented into vacuum, entire orbital cities burned to slag. He had never, in 300 years, seen anything simply cease to have existed. "All fleet elements. Defensive posture, full retreat vector," he began. The order came too late for another 18 ships. Across the tactical display, human vessels moved with an ease that made a mockery of Dominion engineering. They did not maneuver so much as reposition, appearing and vanishing at will, weaving between Kathari formations that had crushed the combined navies of 11 star systems within the same afternoon. Every attempt by Dominion gunners to lock targeting solutions failed instantly, their sensors sliding off the human ships as though the enemy vessels existed in some adjacent version of space that was almost, but not quite, the same as this one. "Commander," Sarek's voice had lost all pretense of composure now. "The Dominion has lost 30% of the fleet. We haven't landed a single confirmed hit. Vexel stared at the display, at the calm, almost gentle way the human ships were dismantling everything he had spent his life building. There was no fury in their attacks, no desperation, no triumphant surge of species finally proving itself against an oppressor. It was, he realized with a chill that went far deeper than fear, routine, as if this was a task the humans had rehearsed 10,000 times in 10,000 simulations, and were now simply executed with the flat efficiency of a species checking an item off a very old list. "They're not trying to win," Vexel said aloud, almost to himself. "They already know they've won." Below, on the surface of the blue world his people had come to conquer, something even stranger was happening. In cities across 6 continents, structures that had shown up on Dominion surveys as nothing more sophisticated than skyscrapers and dams were unfolding. Literally unfolding. Panels sliding away to reveal architecture that had no right to exist inside a primitive agricultural world. Towers extended kilometers into the sky. Something vast and dark began to rise from beneath what Dominion maps had labeled, with contemptuous simplicity, as the Pacific Ocean. "Commander, receiving a new transmission," said the communications officer, her hands trembling over her console. "Source unknown. It's not coming from any of their ships. It's coming from everywhere. Every ship, every ground station, all at once." "Put it through," Vexel said, though every instinct in him screamed to run instead. A voice filled the bridge, calm, unhurried, carrying no trace of anger, and somehow that was more terrifying than any battle cry could have been. "Commander Vexel of the Kathari, Dominion, your fleet has lost 311 vessels in the last 4 minutes. You will lose no more if you choose to listen. We have been expecting you, not you specifically, but someone like you, for a very long time. Stand down your weapons, and we will show you why." Vexel looked at his tactical display, at the graveyard his invasion fleet had already become, and understood, with a particular clarity that only comes at the edge of annihilation, that Earth had not been waiting to be discovered. Earth had been waiting for exactly this moment. Vexel had exactly 2 choices left, and he knew both of their outcomes before he made his decision. He could order the remaining ships of the 9th Conquest Fleet to fight to the last vessel, guaranteeing a slaughter that would be remembered in Dominion history as the single worst military disaster in 3 centuries of expansion. Or he could do something no Kathari commander had done in living memory. He could listen. "Hold all weapons," Vexel said. The order landed on the bridge like a physical blow. He heard Sarek's sharp intake of breath, saw the disbelief ripple through every station. Kathari commanders did not surrender. Kathari commanders did not even pause. But Kathari commanders had also never watched 300 ships vanish from existence in under 5 minutes, and Vexel was, whatever else he was, not a fool. "This is Commander Vexel," he said into the open channel, forcing steadiness into words that felt like ash in his mouth. "The 9th Conquest Fleet stands down. I am listening." The response came not in words, but in light. Space ahead of the ash ground began to bend. Not violently, not with the chaotic tearing of a weapon discharge, but smoothly, deliberately, the way a hand might part a curtain. At the center of that bending light, something vast began to take shape. Not a warship, Vexel realized with mounting dread, but a structure. A single construct larger than some of the Dominion's smaller moons. Its surface a lattice of impossible geometry that seemed to fold in on itself no matter which angle he viewed it from. "Designation," he demanded, though his voice had lost most of its command. "Unknown," Sarek whispered. "Commander, its mass readings don't make sense. It's either the densest object I've ever scanned, or it isn't fully here at all. Some kind of partial phase state. They call it the singularity engine," said the same calm voice that had spoken before, though now it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the bridge like ambient light. "It has taken us 2,700 years to build. It is not primarily a weapon. What you are seeing now is simply the smallest fraction of its function that we chose to show you, enough to end a battle, enough to make certain no more of your people had to die, making a point we had already decided not to make." Vexel found himself staring at the shape on his display, unable to look away, unable to process the scale of what a species could accomplish given 27 centuries, and, apparently, the patience never to use it for conquest. 2,700 years, he repeated. You have possessed weapons capable of annihilating my entire civilization for millennia, and you built farms. Cities. You let us believe you were primitive. We let you see what you expected to see, the voice replied, and for the first time Vexel heard something in it that was not quite human warmth, but was also not the cold calculation he'd braced himself for. Your scouts were never deceived by trickery, Commander. They were shown an honest picture of our surface, agriculture, industry. Cities built the way any young species builds them. What they were never shown was what lies beneath, what lies in the dark behind our moon, what lies in facilities your sensors register as ordinary mountains. We did not lie to you. We simply did not volunteer the rest of the truth, the same as any species was something worth protecting. Why? Vexel said. It was not a demand now, but something closer to a genuine question, one he was startled to realize he actually wanted answered. Why prepare a weapon like this for 3,000 years and never use it? Why let scavenger fleets, pirates, even minor incursions probe your system for decades, when you could have ended every threat in an instant? There was a pause before the answer came. The first hesitation Vexel had heard from this voice, as though the question mattered enough to deserve care rather than the effortless fluency of everything said before. Because the moment we use this to conquer, the voice said, is the moment we become exactly what we build to prevent. The bridge was silent. Even Sarek, who had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of unreadable Kathari composure, stared at the display with an expression Vexel had never seen on him before. Something between horror and a kind of desperate hope. You built the greatest weapon in galactic history, Vexel said slowly, and his entire purpose was to make sure you never had to fire it. Yes, the voice said simply. Commander Vexel, you have lost this battle. Your fleet is at less than 70% strength, and every remaining vessel is within range of total destruction. By the treaties your own dominion enforces on the world you conquer, we are now entitled to dictate whatever terms we choose upon your unconditional surrender. We could annex your empire. We could dismantle your fleets, install a garrison, extract tribute from 47 worlds for the next 1,000 years, exactly as you've done to every species that ever stood in your way. Vexel closed his eyes, waiting for the sentence that would end his career, his reputation, perhaps his life. But that is not why we built this, the voice continued. We are not going to conquer you, Commander. We are going to show you why conquest was never the victory you believed it to be. And then we are going to let you choose what happens next, because a lesson forced upon someone is no lesson at all. It is only another chain. Behind the ash ground, framed by the impossible light of the Singularity engine, the small blue world called Earth continued its quiet orbit, utterly unbothered by the fleet that had come to conquer it and was now, for the first time in 3 centuries of Kathari history, about to be shown mercy instead of ash. They took him alone. That had been Vexel's condition, the last shred of authority he had left to negotiate with. If humanity wanted to show the Kathari dominion whatever lay beneath their world, they would show it to its commander first, and only afterward decide what the rest of his crew would be permitted to see. He had expected a shuttle, an escort, perhaps some ceremonial procession meant to overwhelm him with spectacle. Instead, a single point of light detached itself from the Singularity engine, crossed the distance to the ash ground in less time than it took Vexel to draw breath, and simply deposited him somewhere else. There was no sensation of travel. One moment he stood on his own bridge, surrounded by the wreckage of his ambitions. The next, he stood in a space that made his mind ache to look at directly, a vast circular chamber whose walls seemed to be made of captured starlight, curving upward into a ceiling he could not find the edges of. Commander Vexel. He turned. A figure approached across the chamber floor. Human, or something that had chosen to appear human for his benefit, tall and unhurried, wearing simple dark clothing utterly without ornamentation or rank insignia. There was nothing about the figure that suggested the leader of the most powerful civilization Vexel had ever encountered, and that, he realized, was very likely the point. My name is Iron, the figure said. I am one of the 9 who oversee what you would call our defense council, though after what you are about to see, I suspect the title will feel inadequate to you. Were we, Vexel said. It was not quite a question. Beneath what your survey maps labeled Mount Kilimanjaro, Iron said, one of 41 such facilities scattered across our world, built into mountains, ocean trenches, orbital stations disguised as scientific research platforms your scouts dismissed as harmless. We call this place the Vigil. Come, let me show you why it exists. Iron gestured, and the curving walls of captured starlight resolved into something else entirely. A vast, luminous timeline, stretching in both directions farther than Vexel's eyes could follow, dense with images, dates, moments frozen in impossible detail. 3,040 years ago, Iron said, and the timeline responded, zooming toward its earliest visible point. Our species did to itself what your dominion has done to 47 others. We call it the Last War. It was not fought between humanity and some alien invader, commander. It was fought between us and ourselves, nations, ideologies, competing visions of what humanity should become, each one certain the others had to be conquered or eliminated for peace to finally take hold. The images shifted. Vexel watched. In silence, he could not have broken even if he wanted to, as the timeline showed him ruins. Cities burned not by alien weapons, but by humanity's own hands. Skies choked with ash humans had made for each other, a species standing at the very edge of extinguishing itself entirely. We nearly succeeded, Iron said quietly. Estimates place our population at the war's lowest point, below 400 million, from a species that had once numbered in the billions. We did not win that war, Commander Vexel. Nobody wins a war like that. We simply stopped, because there was almost nothing left to keep fighting over. And from that, Vexel said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise, you built this. From that, Iron agreed, we made a choice. Every surviving nation, every surviving faction, sat together, not because they suddenly trusted each other, but because there was no alternative left. And they asked a question that no civilization at the height of its power ever thinks to ask. What if the goal was never to win the next war? What if the goal was to make certain there never needed to be one? The timeline shifted again, and now Vexel watched centuries compress into moments. Humanity rebuilding, not toward empire, but towards something he had no framework to understand. Cities that grew without ever conquering their neighbors. Technologies developed and then, in case after case, deliberately restrained from military application until the wisdom to use them safely had caught up with the power to use them at all. You had this power for centuries, Vexel said, gesturing at the timeline, at images of Singularity Engine's earliest prototypes taking shape 1,000 years before his own birth. And in all that time, no other species discovered you. No threat ever came. Threats came, Iron corrected gently, 3 times in the last 1,000 years. Other powers detected our system and moved to claim it. Each time, we did exactly what we did to your fleet today, demonstrated enough restraint to end the conflict without erasing an entire people from history. Each time, the outcome was the same as what you're living through now. Because, Commander, the lesson we learn in our own ashes is this. Force can end a war in a single afternoon. It has never once, in the entire history of any civilization we have observed, ended the reasons a war began. Vexel stood in the vast chamber, surrounded by 3,000 years of the species' quiet, patient refusal to become what it had once nearly destroyed itself becoming, and felt something crack open inside him that had been sealed since he was 11 years old, watching his homeworld burn. The Dominion was born from fire, too, he said, the words come before he had decided to speak them. My people were nearly wiped out, for centuries ago, by a rival empire that showed us no mercy. We swore we would never be that vulnerable again. We built a dominion so that no one could ever do to us what was almost done to us. And in doing so, Iron said not unkindly, you became the empire that nearly destroyed you. That is the pattern, Commander Vexel. It is the oldest pattern in the galaxy, and it is not unique to your people, or to mine before the last war. Fear becomes power. Power becomes control. Control becomes exactly the horror it was built to prevent. We did not stop that pattern because we were wiser than you. We stopped it because we were unlucky enough to nearly die learning the lesson firsthand, and lucky enough to survive long enough to remember it. Vexel looked at the timeline, at 3,000 years of restraint stretched out before him like a rebuke and an invitation both at once, and understood, with a clarity that felt like grief, exactly how much of his life, He had spent proving a lesson humanity had already learned and buried in its own ashes centuries before he was born. "Show me," Vexel said, and his voice did not sound like the voice of Commander anymore. It sounded like a man asking to see something he already suspected would break him. "You said you have watched other powers before mine. You said you observed the Dominion. How much do you know about what we've done?" Iron was quiet for a long moment, and when the timeline shifted again, Vexel understood that this was not a question Iron had wanted to answer so directly, but he had asked, and humanity, whatever else it was, did not appear to be a species that lied by omission when directly confronted. The chamber filled with new images. Not Earth's history now, but his own 47 star systems, each one rendered in exacting, unbearable detail. Vexel watched his own fleet's conquest of the Dravoni Reach, a campaign he had personally commanded 80 years ago, unfold again in front of him from an angle he had never been forced to witness. Not the tactical display of Dominion victory, but the ground-level reality of a species watching its cities burn, its resistance fighters executed in public squares as an example, its children marched into labor camps that the Dominion's official records had euphemistically labeled resettlement zones. "Stop," Vexel said. The image did not stop. "You asked me to show you," Iron said, and there was no cruelty in the words, only a terrible, patient honesty. "You have spent 300 years believing that swift conquest minimizes suffering, Commander Vexel. I am not going to let you keep believing that in this room. Look." He looked. He had no choice. The images surrounded him now, layered one atop another. Decades of Dominion history playing out in a compressed, merciless truth. He saw campaigns he had led personally, campaigns his mentors had led before him, campaigns still being fought by his own subordinates on distant worlds even as he stood in this chamber. He saw the Dominion's official casualty reports beside the actual numbers, the gap between them so vast it made the lie feel almost quaint in its dishonesty. He saw 47 worlds, each one conquered under the same doctrine he had recited to Sarek less than a day ago. Overwhelming force, applied swiftly, minimized suffering. He saw, for the first time in his life, exactly how much suffering minimized still meant. "We have never intervened," Iron said quietly, as the images finally began to fade. "Not once, in all the centuries we watched your Dominion expand. That is not a comfort I offer lightly, Commander. It has weighed on every council we have held. But we learn in our own war that a species forced into peace by an outside power rarely stays at peace once that power looks away. Change that last has to come from within. We could have stopped your Dominion 100 years ago. We chose instead to wait and hope that a day would come when your people looked at what they built and chose themselves to stop. And if that day never came," Vexel asked, his voice raw, "if we had simply kept expanding forever, then eventually," Iron said, "your fleets would have reached us, exactly as they did today, and we would have done exactly what we did today, ended the battle without ending your people, and hoped that this time, finally, someone standing where you were standing would be capable of hearing what we have to say." Vexel sank slowly onto the chamber floor, the weight of 300 years and 47 worlds finally, fully, landing on him at once. "Why me?" he said. "Why is it my fleet you chose to make this offer to? Why not the commander before me or the one before her?" "We didn't choose you, Commander," Iron said, and for the first time, something that might have been sympathy entered the voice. "Your Dominion chose to send its fleet to our system today, on this particular rotation of your conquest campaigns, under your particular command. We have been ready for this conversation for a very long time. We simply had to wait for someone to arrive and have it with." Silence stretched between them. Vexel thought of Sarek, waiting aboard the wounded Ashground, and the 600 crew members still alive, because he had chosen, in his final decision as an undefeated commander, to stop rather than to fight to the last ship. He thought of his cadet self, 11 years old, watching his homeworld burn, swearing an oath that had led, somehow, across 3 centuries, to this exact chamber, this exact reckoning. "What happens now," he asked, "if I go back and tell the Dominion Council the truth? That Earth could have annihilated our entire fleet and chose not to? They will not believe restraint was a weakness on your part, Iron. They will believe it was an opportunity. They will send everything we have. They might, Iron agreed. That is, in fact, the most likely outcome, based on every pattern we have observed in 17 other first contact scenarios across our history. Which is why we are not simply going to let you leave with a story to tell. We're going to give you a choice. Commander Vexel, one your Dominion Council will never be offered, because they will never stand in this room and see what you have seen. The timeline behind Iron shifted one final time, and now it showed not the past, but something that had not yet happened. A projection, Vexel realized, of two futures branching from this exact moment. In one, the Dominion Council received his report, dismissed it as sentimental weakness, and launched a full invasion fleet that the Singularity Engine's own long-range ejections showed being erased as completely and as mercilessly as his own fleet very nearly had been. In the other, something Vexel had no framework for imagining at all, 47 worlds unshackled, an empire dismantled from within by the very commander who had helped build it. "You're asking me to overthrow my own civilization," Vexel said. "We are asking you," Iron said, "to finish the war you actually came here to fight. Not the one against us. Commander, the one against what your own fear built 400 years ago and never let go of since." Commander Vexel returned to the ash ground 7 hours after he had left it, and in those 7 hours, Sarek had aged a decade in worry alone, certain his commander had been executed, imprisoned, or worse. Instead, Vexel walked back onto his own bridge, carrying something Sarek had never once seen on his face in 15 years of service together. Not defeat, not fear. Something closer to grief mixed with an unfamiliar, dangerous kind of hope. "Commander," Sarek said carefully, "what did they show you?" "Everything," Vexel said. "Everything we've done. Everything we called mercy, while calling it conquest in the same breath." He turned to face his bridge crew, the survivors of battle that should have ended in the Dominion's usual, effortless victory and had instead ended in humbling, near-total defeat. "I am not returning to the Council with a report recommending further military action against the system. I am returning with a report recommending the complete dismantling of the Kadhari Dominion's conquest doctrine, effective immediately across all 47 occupied worlds." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vexel had ever heard. He knew, standing there, that this would likely end his career, possibly his life. Dominion Council members did not respond kindly to commanders who returned from unprecedented military disasters, recommending the Empire dissolve itself as penance. But he also knew, with a certainty that felt entirely new and entirely his own, that he would rather die making that recommendation than live another year enforcing an occupation he now understood, completely and without any comforting illusion left, as the same wound his own people had once suffered, inflicted 47 times over onto worlds that had never done anything to deserve it. What Vexel could not have known, standing on his damaged bridge and preparing for what he assumed would be a court-martial, was that Iron and the Nine had not sent him home with only a story and a conscience. Hidden within the Singularity Engine's final gesture before releasing the Ninth Conquest Fleet, a gesture Vexel's own sensors had registered only as a harmless diagnostic pulse, Earth had transmitted something far more consequential across every surviving Dominion vessel, an offer addressed not to Vexel alone, but to the Dominion Council itself, delivered simultaneously to every world in the Empire the moment his fleet crossed back into Dominion space. It was not a threat. It was not an ultimatum. It was, in its entirety, a single choice laid out with the same patient clarity Iron had shown Vexel in the chamber beneath Kilimanjaro: continue the Dominion's current path, and eventually, inevitably, meet a species with both the power and the will to end it by force, or begin now, while the choice still belonged to the Dominion alone, the long work of becoming something else. The Council did not believe Vexel's report at first. 3 separate committees reviewed the Ninth Fleet's sensor logs. Certain some catastrophic error explained the loss of over 300 vessels to an enemy with no prior combat record anywhere in Dominion archives. It was only when Earth's own transmission arrived, precise, undeniable, accompanied by data no Dominion scientist could refute, that the full weight of what had happened at that quiet blue world began to settle over the Council chambers. What followed was not a single dramatic moment of surrender, but something slower, messier, and far more human than anyone on either side had expected. Factions within the Dominion Council fractured. Some demanded immediate retaliation, unable to accept that restraint had defeated them rather than weakness. Others, including several who had spent decades quietly troubled by the cost of conquest they never had the political cover to question aloud, saw in Vexel's report the opening they had been waiting for. It took 11 years, not a single afternoon of triumph, but over a decade of negotiation, internal conflict, and the slow, difficult work of unwinding an empire that had convinced itself, for 4 centuries, that domination was the only alternative to annihilation. Vexel spent those 11 years not as a disgraced commander, but improbably as a reluctant architect of his own civilization's transformation, traveling from world to world across the Dominion's holdings, telling the story of a fleet that had come to conquer and left instead, having been taught. One by one, the 47 occupied worlds were granted their independence, not with the swift, tidy finality of a single ceremony, but through years of reparation, rebuilding, and the uncomfortable work of a species learning to be trusted again by people it spent centuries subjugating. Some worlds forgave slowly, some never fully did, and the Dominion, no longer an empire, but a loose confederation now calling itself simply the Kathari Union, accepted that some wounds would outlive the war that caused them, and that accepting this was itself part of the lesson Earth had offered. Commander Vexel, no longer a commander of anything but a small research vessel dedicated to a very different mission, returned to Earth exactly once more in his lifetime, 12 years after the day his fleet had first entered its system. He did not come with warships. He came alone, aboard a modest transport, carrying nothing but a request to speak once more with Iron, if Iron would still see him. Iron met him in the same chamber beneath Kilimanjaro, the same timeline stretching across walls of captured starlight, though now it carried new images at its farthest edge, 47 worlds, no longer occupied, beginning the long work of building something that had not existed in Kathari history before, a civilization measured not by the systems it conquered, but by the wars it no longer needed to fight. "You did it," Iron said, and it was not a question. "We're still doing it," Vexel corrected. "I don't think it's the kind of thing that finishes." "No," Iron agreed, something that might have been a ghost of a smile crossing an expression Vexel had never quite learned to read. "It isn't. That's rather the point." Vexel looked out at the timeline one last time, at 3,000 years of patient restraint that ended not in a war, but in a lesson passed from one grieving civilization to another, and understood, finally, standing in the quiet beneath a mountain on a world he had once come to conquer, that humanity's greatest weapon had never been the singularity engine at all. It had been the discipline never to need it. And somewhere among the stars, on 47 worlds once chained and now finally free, a new generation was growing up learning a lesson the Kathari Dominion had taken 400 years, one devastating defeat, and the quiet grace of the species that chose not to conquer them to finally understand. The strongest civilization in the galaxy was never the one that won every war. It was the one that no longer needed to.